Okay, next we're going to move on to where businesses can get money from. In other words, sources of finance. This finance might be used to start the business or for expansion. What's really important with this topic is to remember that different sources of finance are suitable for different types of businesses or in different situations. Your exam case study will give you information that will help you decide which sources of finance should be used. Remember, the examiner will be looking for realistic ideas. Here are the sources of finance we're going to discuss. So sources, as you can see, can be internal or external. If we look here at internal, you can see a firm can gain finance from profit, working capital or sale of assets. The alternative is external finance, which can either be short-term or long-term. If it's short-term, finance can come from an overdraft, a loan, trade credit or debt factoring. If it's longer-term finance that's needed, it can be share capital or loan capital. Loan capital includes mortgages, debentures or venture capital. Let's have a look at these sources in more detail before we have a go at some exam questions. We'll start with the internal sources of finance. Profit is the most common form of finance used by businesses, as they won't have to pay anyone else to use this money. But don't forget that shareholders may want profit to be used for their dividends rather than being reinvested. If a firm can't use profit, it could sell off an unused asset and gain finance this way. Obviously, this depends on whether the business has any unused assets to sell off. The last internal way of raising finance is through working capital. If a firm can improve its working capital, it can provide a source of finance. It could do this by trying to get back any money owed to it, or cutting credit terms, so that at any one time it should be owed less money. The firm could also pay its own suppliers later, but these actions may well upset a firm's customers and suppliers, and lead to them not wanting to do business with them. Another way to free up money would be to have less tied up in stock, but again there could be a drawback, because a firm wants to make sure it can meet sudden increases in orders. Really, there are pros and cons of all sources of finance, and it's important that you try and point these out to the examiner, as this will help you get analysis marks. You'll get application marks as well if you're basing any suggestions on the type of business in the case study. So, we've looked at internal sources, but if enough can't be raised, a business will have to use external sources. Now, these can be divided between short-term and long-term sources. Which a business opts for depends on its circumstances. For example, how much money they need and how much they're prepared to pay for it. An overdraft is really a common short-term option and is useful because it can be arranged quickly, but it won't give the business large sums of money and interest will be charged on the overdraft. A loan might be better if the business needs more finance, because a set amount can be borrowed from the bank and paid back regularly with agreed interest charges. Debt factoring could also be used as a source of finance. It's when a business who's owed money decides to sell the debts to another firm. Now, this firm will give them the value of the debt minus their admin fee. So the business selling the debt ends up with their money sooner than if they'd waited for their debtors to pay them. The downside is that they won't get the full amount back, as they've had to pay the factor the admin charge. Finally, for short-term finance, you can use trade credit. Now, this is when you pay your creditors, in other words, people you owe money to, as late as possible. For example, your supplier might give you 90 days to pay. This can help raise finance without paying any interest on it, but consider how a supplier would view this. As it's part of working capital, it can be classed as an internal source of finance, or on its own, it's an external source. Let's move on to long-term sources. Larger amounts of money tend to come from this source and can be either share capital or loan capital. Share capital can be raised in limited companies, which can sell shares to the public to raise finance. In return, those buying the shares get what's called a dividend, which is a share of the firm's profit. The problem for shareholders is that they won't necessarily get paid a dividend Because even if the business makes a profit, some might be reinvested. The problem for the business owners is that by selling shares, they could lose control of the business. So that's share capital. The other type was loan capital. Now this can include debentures, mortgages and venture capital. Debentures can only be used by limited companies, so can be an alternative to issuing shares. And they're long-term loans to a business that have a fixed interest rate and a set final payment date. But like I said, these are only for limited companies. If the company isn't limited, then mortgages are often used. A mortgage is like a long-term loan and generally uses the firm's property as security. So if the firm doesn't make the set repayments, the property can be taken. The final source of long-term finance we'll look at is venture capital. Venture capitalists provide money for high-risk businesses where other types of investors are unwilling to lend. They make their money by charging interest on the loans and by gaining shares in the business.